From Bakhmut to Belgorod, it's been a pretty hectic few days for Ukraine and Russia. And while Bakhmut fell to Russian forces, it's possible that both sides got what they wanted out of that battle. And the situation in Belgorod, which is still ongoing as of this recording, risks distracting Russia from other areas of the war. The battle for the city of Bakhmut has ended, at least for now. Bakhmut sits in Donetsk Oblast, approximately 30 kilometers from Russian annexed territories of Ukraine from 2014. And prior to the start of this battle, the town was home to around 71,000 people and made up an area of about 41 square kilometers. Russia's been slowly pushing towards Bakhmut really since the start of the full-scale invasion in February 2022. Starting from their previously annexed territories, Russian forces first took Popasna in the start of May 2022, then continued westwards towards Bakhmut. Russian forces reached the outskirts of Bakhmut this past fall, in the October-November timeframe, when fighting really started to intensify around the city. Then March, April, and most of May saw some pretty heavy urban combat until the city was declared captured by Wagner forces on May 21st. Now, it's way too early to make any major judgments about this fight. I mean, for one, it's not really over. Yes, Russia holds the city itself, or what's left of the city, but the fighting still rages just outside of town, where Ukrainian forces have pushed back Russian positions to the north and south. And as recent as May 22nd, just yesterday, there were reports of skirmishes on the edge of Bakhmut itself. I know it's really tempting to make sweeping judgments here as to what this means for the war going forward, but the truth is, I don't know. There's just too many variables that we don't have insight into. That said, if you're willing to put up with some assumptions on my end, I'll lay out a few thoughts as to what this could mean. First, as of today, May 23rd, this has been a political win for Russia, which is a loss for Ukraine. I'll get into the battlefield and impact of the war in a second, but this is worth hitting on. Saying political victory isn't a way of downplaying the battle. You can't separate war and politics, and sometimes the message that comes out of a fight is more important than the actual repercussions on the battlefield. To me, this is a pretty clear political victory for Russia because it's easily communicated and understood. Russia took Bakhmut. If there's any doubt, there's pictures of Wagner forces on the western edge of town, and just about all mapping services have updated Bakhmut to be under total Russian control. So for someone not closely following the war or not interested in digging in deep to how this battle actually played out, it's a quick headline that shows Russia continues to advance. And you can nitpick how long it took, the cost, or anything else, but at the end of the day, there were a bunch of articles over the last few days with a headline that essentially read, "Russia takes Bakhmut." That matters on the political front. Now on to the battlefield, and this is where I'm going to have to make some assumptions to try to determine what this means going forward. The reason I say that is that we don't know exactly how this fight was designed to fit into broader Ukrainian or Russian plans. Okay, so the original argument for taking Bakhmut was that it secured a logistical hub and opened up access for Russian forces to take Sloviansk and Kramatorsk. And it does. Just looking at a map, you can see how those two could very well now be in Russian sights. But I don't think we're going to see any movement there anytime soon. Bakhmut wasn't taken by the Russian military, but by Wagner forces, who supposedly are exiting Ukraine in June. Now, wait and see on that one, but given the tension between their leader, Yevgeny Prigozhin, and the Ministry of Defense, and the restrictions placed on their recruiting, no more prisoners, it's not crazy that the Wagner role in Ukraine could be reduced or removed entirely. So that leaves us with the Russian armed forces, who haven't had a successful offensive operation of significance since last summer. And they've tried. From Kreminna to Marinka, Volodar, and Avdiivka, they've been on the offensive for months, but don't have much, if anything, to show for it. So for that Russian military to all of a sudden create and exploit a breakthrough towards Sloviansk, it's hard to imagine right now. Honestly, my big takeaway right now from the Battle of Bakhmut is that I'm wondering if it'll be like the Somme was in World War I. Big plans, big ideas with modest gains in relation to the overall front, and substantial casualties on both sides that may or may not directly influence the outcome of the war. As a little background, the first Battle of the Somme was fought from July to November 1916 on the western front of World War I. It was an attack planned by the British and the French against German positions in the north of France, and there were a few ideas behind this campaign. One was to relieve stress from the French positions at Verdun, and the other was to create a breakthrough in the German lines that could be the unraveling of their positions, leading to an end of the war. But when it was all said and done, Germany was pushed back just 40 kilometers, and that came at a cost of 1 million total casualties, including 19,000 British soldiers killed on the first day alone. Both sides then reset their lines, and the war continued on for another 2 years. Now, one of the purposes of that battle that's gotten more attention after the fact is the idea that the Allies were trying to grind down the German war machine. Straight attrition warfare. Overall, the losses were roughly equal, but Germany was drawing on a smaller pool of men and equipment, so the idea does kind of fit. But if that actually worked is still debated today, more than 100 years later. That all makes me think of Bakhmut, just on a smaller scale. I mean, much of the Russian rhetoric for some time now has been about an attritional focused war. This is what that can look like. Lots of lives, little terrain, and relatively unknown impact. That is, of course, unless the battle had a significant impact on either side's ability to continue the fight. But that's not immediately clear. That brings us to the Ukrainian counteroffensive. If Ukraine doesn't kick off anything major in the next few months, I think it's safe to assume they took a pretty significant hit at Bakhmut and need time to regenerate forces for any sort of major offensive operation. Finally, there's the possibility that both sides got what they wanted out of this. Russia gained a political victory, easily shown by progress on the map, and Ukraine focused Russia's attention on one small sector of the battlefield while they mustered forces for their counteroffensive. I don't mean that Ukraine is creating some sort of trap at Bakhmut or that losing the town is all part of the plan. Instead, it's the idea that rather than simply withdrawing to the heights west of Bakhmut, which was thrown out as a pretty viable option months ago when it looked like they were about to be surrounded, Ukraine stayed and fought, forcing Russia to commit resources and attention. Overall, the value of Bakhmut depends on what comes next. It was never a war-winning or war-losing battle. I mean, the war isn't being fought over that specific territory, and it's not so significant a piece of terrain to factor into future negotiations. So, we wait. Wait and see if the effects from the battle are noticeable and how either side operates in the near future. Because as of today, aside from the clear political victory, the overall situation on the battlefield looks pretty similar to how it did before Bakhmut was taken by Russian forces. All right, Belgorod. This one is messy and still unfolding as I record. One day after Russia declared victory at Bakhmut, they found themselves on the defensive in Belgorod. Belgorod is to the northeast of Ukraine and has been somewhat center stage when it comes to partisan-type activity inside of Russia. This is where quite a few train derailments have happened over the last few months and the site of two previous cross-border raids in March and April. This time was different, though. This grouping appears to have destroyed a Russian border checkpoint and driven armored vehicles straight into Russia. After that, though, we've got a ton of conflicting reports as to what is actually happening. For starters, it does look like there are two main groups working together here, the Russian Volunteer Corps and the Freedom of Russia Legion. Now, I made a video recently talking about the Russian Volunteer Corps. In short, it's a pretty extremist group that's more anti-Putin than they are pro-Ukraine. In fact, the Russian Volunteer Corps has been pretty critical of Zelensky at times, and while they claim to be a part of the Ukrainian military, it's not clear if they've taken part in any major operations so far in the war. Finally, the RVC, or Russian Volunteer Corps, is aimed at creating a Russian ethno-state. So no other nationalities, no ethnicities, no other languages, etc. I feel like that's getting glossed over in a lot of recent reports. The second organization, the Freedom of Russia Legion, is quite a bit different. Now, while both of these organizations are made up of Russians, the Freedom of Russia Legion was formed after the initial invasion by a company of Russian soldiers that defected to the Ukrainian side. And the FRL has taken part in combat operations in the east and appear to be a formal part of the Ukrainian Foreign Legion. Just like the Russian Volunteer Corps, the Legion wants to see a change in Russia, and that's their primary goal in the overall war. And to that end, they put out a recent video explaining just what they stand for.
Мы такие же россияне, как и вы. Мы такие же люди, как и вы. Мы хотим, чтобы наши дети росли в мире и были свободными людьми, чтобы они могли путешествовать, учиться и просто были счастливы в свободной стране. Но этому нет места в современной путинской России, прогнившей насквозь от коррупции, вранья, цензуры, ограничений свобод и репрессий. В той России, где жизнь человека значит меньше, чем кошелек чиновника. В той России, где прокладывают отдельную железную дорогу в резиденцию бункерного деда, вместо того, чтобы отремонтировать дороги в регионах. В диктаторской стране, где за призывы к миру детей разлучают с родителями, а подросткам дают пожизненные сроки. Но диктатуре Кремля пришло время положить конец. Спасибо всем тем, кто поддерживает нас, кто отправляет нам донаты и курит там, где надо. Ваша поддержка – это то, что каждый день напоминает нам о нашей финальной цели на Красной площади. Будьте смелыми и не бойтесь, потому что мы возвращаемся домой. Россия будет свободной.
In terms of the information war, the FRL is going to come across pretty nicely to Western audiences, and they probably know it. Now, I wouldn't be surprised if much of the media focus during and after this event in Belgorod highlights the FRL and their mission and minimizes or ignores the entirety of the Russian Volunteer Corps. But either way, these are both organized groups with stated goals and some degree of connection with the Ukrainian military. There are a few maps here worth looking at that show how far they appear to have made it into Russian territory. Most of the breakdowns I've seen of contested area is about 20 square kilometers on or about. One interesting note here is that it doesn't look like these attackers left, but rather dug in, and even reports coming out this morning are that they're still there. Pretty quickly after this kicked off, Russia announced that the military, border guards, National Guard, and FSB were removing enemy forces, and the governor of Belgorod saying that a counterterrorism operation was ongoing to clean up the area. In terms of the Russian response, I did see some videos and pictures of Russian aircraft operating in the area, and Russia did conduct artillery and mortar strikes against the attacking forces. On the other hand, the FRL posted a telegram this morning, quote, "The Russian army could not oppose anything to a group of patriot volunteers who took up arms and were not afraid to openly go against the Moscow regime for the free future of Russia. Once again, the myth that the citizens of the Russian Federation are safe and the Russian Federation is strong has been destroyed. In fact, the authorities have been stealing the budget for years and lying that everything is fine." They continue, quote, "The Russian Federation has no reserves to respond to military crises. All servicemen are dead, wounded, or in Ukraine. The Russian Federation is absolutely not protected. There is panic in the Belgorod region. Partly there is an organized evacuation, but for the most part, it is a spontaneous fight," end quote. Shortly thereafter, the Russian Ministry of Defense put out their statement as to what was going on in Belgorod, saying, quote, "In the course of the counter-terrorist operation, as a result of airstrikes, artillery fire, and active action by units of the Western Military District that covered the state border, the nationalist formations have been blocked and destroyed. The remaining nationalists were pushed back into Ukraine, where they continue to be hit until they have been completely eliminated," adding that enemy losses were over 70 Ukrainian terrorists, 4 armored fighting vehicles, and 5 pickup trucks. Worth noting, there have been a few videos out there showing supposed Russian strikes on these positions, but from what I've seen at least, it's nowhere near enough to produce the total destruction that the Ministry of Defense is claiming. I mean, if Russia had completely removed this threat and all was back to normal in Belgorod, they'd likely be pretty quick to showcase the destroyed equipment as well as the killed or captured personnel. And an update now on top of this. So after recording, pictures started to come out from Russian Telegram channels showing some of the captured equipment from this group in the Belgorod region, along with some claims that the border checkpoints that they crossed have been recaptured and are back under Russian control. Now let's get into what this means and how it's being perceived. For starters, it does matter. While the victory at Bakhmut was a clear political win for Russia, this is a clear political loss. Bakhmut should have been the top headline for a while now, but with this small group pressing into Russia, most of the attention has shifted to Belgorod. And there's no good way to write off an enemy force crossing your border so easily in a time of war. I mean, with all the layered defenses going up in the south, it looks like Russia just completely forgot about this area. But this area is their actual border with Russian citizens on the other side. So even if every one of those fighters is killed or captured, it's going to raise some concern about the quality of Russian border defenses elsewhere. Overall, I don't think that framing this as an invasion or a civil war paints the most accurate picture. I mean, technically, it could lead to larger fighting inside of Russia, but as we sit here today, I think it's best to view this incursion and the fallout from it as a distraction. I don't say that to take away from the causes of the two groups involved, but this looks like something that's mutually beneficial to them and Ukraine. They get the opportunity to take up arms against Russia, as they've been talking about, and Ukraine gets a media distraction from Bakhmut and an internal headache for Russia. I thought it'd be worthwhile to show what some Russian commentators are saying about this, so I started down that rabbit hole and then saw that Samuel Romani of Rusi had already done that. So I'm going to leverage some of his work here to show those reactions. First is sort of the official Russian response, that what's happening in Belgorod was no more than an information operation and doesn't really hold any military significance. Now, I mean, there is an information piece here for sure. On the other hand, if Ukraine is on the verge of launching an attack anywhere else, this may have been a relatively easy way to pull in a lot of attention elsewhere. I mean, Russia already moved some local resources to help in this fight, and I wouldn't be surprised if there's a call for increased manning at other border crossings. I mean, those are all troops that then can't be quickly shifted to the site of a larger attack. Then pro-Russian military blogger Alexander Kots complained about the lack of equipment, at the border, asking where the surveillance and monitoring assets are, where are the minefields, where are the ATGMs, asking how can an armored column just drive miles into Russia without any serious resistance? He's got a point. Sergei Markov, a former advisor to President Putin, who's a relative hardliner, took this as an opportunity to ramp things up even further, saying that Russia needs to finally hit the decision-making centers in Ukraine, take Kharkiv, and roll out a new wave of mobilization, saying that this attack in Belgorod will unite the people to understand that Putin must take a harder stance against Ukraine. Last one here, Igor Girkin, who usually has a pretty doomsday type approach to anything Russia does or fails to do, was pretty modest in his assessment, saying that it's really nothing of significant unless, as he has predicted earlier, that it's tied to the beginning of a larger offensive with a goal of diverting troops from other areas. Now, as expected, Russia is referring to this as an operation by the Ukrainian military, and Ukraine has been pretty silent, and I don't really expect that to change. It's in Russia's best interest to present this as an exclusively Ukrainian effort and ignore the Russians in these formations as well as those Russian groups' stated goals. It's also in Ukraine's best interest to pass this off as some groups operating outside of their control and not something directly organized and sanctioned by the state. And I wouldn't expect the RVC or FRL positions to be reinforced by organic Ukrainian units anytime soon. I mean, while this raid may be beneficial to the overall Ukrainian effort, it's more likely that they're going to take advantage of the distraction this causes to focus their efforts elsewhere. So things are really picking up, and I got a feeling that we're going to be hearing a lot more from these two areas, Bakhmut and Belgorod, over the next few weeks. That's all I got for now. Thanks for watching. We'll see y'all next time.